and welcome to Ye Olde Bestsellers Book Club, where I am reading through some of America's earliest best-selling novels, as reported by The Bookman, a literary magazine of the 1890s. Today's novel made it onto the Bookman's bestsellers lists in 1899, When Knighthood Was in Flower by Charles Major, or The Love Story of Charles Brandon and Mary Tudor, the King's sister, and happening in the reign of His August Majesty King Henry VIII, because really long full titles were a thing for books in this time, apparently. The author, Charles Major, was a lawyer by trade, and Knighthood was his first published novel. As its title would suggest, it is a historical romance of the Tudor period about the real historical figures of Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon, and it uses a somewhat similar framing device to Hugh Wynne, the last book that I read, which was a fictional memoir that opened with the character of Hugh talking about how his memoir came to be. When Knighthood Was in Flower takes it a step further, being originally published under the pseudonym Edwin Caskoden, which is actually the name of the book's narrator. Actually, narrators. The Edwin who opens the novel is a fictional 19th century man who claims to have written this book based on the memoirs of his ancestor, also named Edwin Caskoden, who lived in the Tudor period, with the language edited to be more friendly to modern readers. Quote, I might give you the exact words in which Sir Edwin wrote, but I fear the pleasure of perusal would but poorly pay for the trouble, as the English of the bluff king is almost a foreign tongue to us. So if you happen to find 16th century thought hobnobbing in the same sentence with 19th century English, be not disturbed, I did it. End quote. So the bulk of the story will be told by Tudor-era Edwin, in a story transcribed and translated by Victorian-era Edwin, who is the fake persona/pseudonym of Charles Major. This is far more complicated than it needed to be. It could have just been a novel narrated by a historical character without a framing device containing two separate men both named Edwin, but I do find it very charming, so I guess this is fine. Sir Edwin Caskoden was the master of dance in the court of King Henry VIII. Charles Brandon arrives at court with a heroic reputation, but not much else, not even a knighthood. A lot of people are talking about him, though, because he has just won a very dramatic duel. He and his elder brother had gone gambling, and they lost, but their opponent cheated, so they go to fight him, and their dad tags along. And first the elder brother and then the father land a blow which should have killed the cheat, but instead their swords snap and they are killed. Brandon figures out that their opponent is secretly wearing a chainmail shirt, which is probably also cheating, so he changes tactics. He fights very defensively and just tires the guy out, and eventually the cheat falls to his knees and begs for his life, and so Brandon cuts through both of his eyes and the bridge of his nose with his sword, leaving him alive but horrifically mutilated. This is a charming introduction to our romantic hero. Edwin first meets Brandon at a tournament. Quote, he wore neither mustachio nor beard, as men now disfigure their faces, and his clear-cut profile, dilating nostrils, and mobile though firm-set mouth gave pleasing assurance of tenderness, gentleness, daring, and strength. End quote. You just know a man is gentle yet brave when his nostrils can dilate and his mouth is mobile. King Henry's sister, Mary, is very intrigued by this stranger with the hot nostrils, which displeases Henry. Edwin and Brandon are very fast friends, and immediately request adjoining rooms when Brandon is given a position at court in the King's Guard. So they hang out a lot in their joint sitting room, where they, quote, told each other all our secrets for all the world like a pair of girls, end quote, and frequently discuss feminology. Quote, Brandon had seen many an adventure during his life on the continent, which would not do to write down here. I was as great a braggart of my inches as ever drew the longbow. Gods, I flush up hot even now when I think of it, end quote. So, Brandon's a man-whore, Edwin is proud of his inches. I don't think that means inches the way it sounds like it should. I think he's just saying he brags about his achievements, but I mean, either way. Edwin also has a pretty close friendship with the Princess Mary. He tells us that she's very beautiful. Among other things, quote, her feet and hands were small and apparently made for the sole purpose of driving mankind distracted, end quote. Masculine beauty is stored in the nostrils, feminine beauty is stored in the feet. Got it. Mostly due to this beauty, practically every man at court has fallen in love with her at one point or another, including Edwin, who one day, years ago, fell to his knees before her and gave a passionate proclamation of his feelings, which Mary tried very hard not to laugh at. She gently redirected his attention to her dearest lady-in-waiting, named Jane, who Edwin became infatuated with before he even picked himself up off the floor. His courting of Jane was made a little more difficult by the fact that she was listening from behind the curtains while he told Mary things like, quote, "The universe will crumble and the heavens roll up as a scroll ere my love shall alter or pale," end quote, before admitting almost immediately that this isn't actually true. He has even, quote, said substantially the same thing to a dozen others, end quote. That part Jane never finds out about, and at the time of the main story, he has a pretty stable courtship with her and a dear friendship with Mary. Mary herself, despite all of the suitors falling at her feet, has never had any romantic feelings for anyone, and, quote, held love and its sufferings in utter scorn, end quote. Brandon first meets Mary when he is sent to fetch her for the Queen one afternoon. Now, he knows where to find her, but not what she looks like, and she is surrounded by a group of other girls. Apparently, when he sees this group, he does pick her out immediately because she's just so pretty and captivating that surely she must be the princess. But he pretends like he doesn't know which one is her, which he shouldn't anyways. It's weird that he does. But he asks them, quote, "Have I the honor to find the Princess Mary among these ladies? Is the Princess Mary a person of so little consequence about the court that she is not known to a mighty captain of the guard?" End quote. Brandon says it's not his place to say what her standing is at court, but he is certain she must not be among these girls, because the princess surely wouldn't have been so rude, and then he turns to leave. Mary orders him to stop and deliver his message, and he plays that stupid game where you ask someone else nearby to deliver a message to a person who is clearly standing within earshot because you're annoyed with them and you don't want to talk directly to them, and also usually because you're in middle school or something. Brandon. He passes on the summons from the Queen and then points out that given that he's never seen her before, it's not exactly his fault that he didn't know what she looked like, and her reaction was totally unjustified, which would be totally fair, except for the fact that he did know, magically, and chose to pretend that he didn't just to be antagonistic, but let's ignore that. Brandon leaves, and Mary feels bad, realizing that she was wrong, and says, quote, "He acted like a man, and looked like one too when he defended himself. For once I have found a real live man, full of manliness," end quote. What does any of that mean? Is passive-aggressively refusing to speak to someone standing 2 feet to your left manly? How many times can you say man in one paragraph? Mary has Brandon brought back and apologizes for her behavior, and as they walk to meet the Queen, they have a nice conversation, partially about the concepts of morality and goodness, which ends with him saying that he thinks, despite any faults, that she has a purely good heart. And she says, quote, "People have deluged me with all kinds of flattery, but no one has ever gone to the extravagant length of calling me good. I like it best. If I am beautiful or not, it is as God made me, and I have nothing to do with it, and desire no credit. But if I could only be good, it might be my own doing," end quote. And, this was all going pretty well, and then Brandon says that her capacity to be good, quote, "will eventually all depend upon the man you marry. He can make out of you a perfect woman or the reverse," end quote. Lovely. Mary's opinion of Brandon after this meeting is much higher than mine, so shortly thereafter she arranges a sort of double date, inviting Edwin and Brandon to meet with her and Jane in her drawing room for dancing and card playing, which is especially exciting because it's a little bit scandalous to have that few people in a private group of both men and women. The four have a great time, they're all very giggly, Jane plays the lute while Brandon and Mary dance, and Edwin raves internally at length about how beautiful Mary is for, the 37th time, until he has to say in narrative, quote, "But I had better stop," end quote. And he asks Jane, quote, "Was there ever a goodlier couple?" end quote, and Jane agrees, and he gets annoyed, quote, "I was jealous because I feared it was Brandon's beauty to which she referred. I knew what my feelings were toward Mary, and I judged, or rather misjudged, Jane by myself," end quote, and then he raves about how hot Mary is for another half a paragraph, her and her, quote, "distracting little foot and ankle," end quote. Edwin justifies himself with, quote, "A woman, God bless her, if she really loves a man, has no thought of any other. But a man may love one woman with the warmth of a simoon and at the same time feel like a good, healthy south wind toward a dozen others. One average woman has enough goodness in her to supply an army of men," end quote. I am going to kill this man. Over the course of the night, Mary gets mad multiple times over nothing and keeps having to apologize. She's very exhausting also. Edwin and Jane get to dance, they all have fun, and at the end of the evening, Mary sends the boys home with a cup of wine each, which she takes a drink out of before handing each of them over. That's a little weird. Was that a thing? Later, Mary invites Brandon to a party she's hosting. Apparently she throws a lot of exclusive dances, and he sends her back a handwritten note accepting her invitation, which is apparently a very bold and forward thing to do to the princess, and this agitates her. She keeps putting the note away and then taking it back out to reread it and then hiding it again in her pocket, in her bodice. Then she notices that Jane has been sitting quietly in the window this whole time watching, and gets very mad and embarrassed, says, quote, "How dare you watch me, hussy," end quote, and then slaps her. She doesn't even apologize for that one, but they get over it startlingly fast. Now, at the party, the king and queen are present, and this queen would be Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and Edwin notes that she is, quote, "considerably older than Henry," end quote. She is 6 years older, which, funny enough, is exactly the age gap between Brandon and Mary, just going the other way. I know it wasn't viewed the same when the woman was older, but still, considerably. She's also, 29. How haggard. Earlier, Catherine was also described as, quote, "black and leathery enough to frighten a satyr," end quote, so I think Edwin just doesn't like her. The most notable things that happen at this party are that Brandon thoroughly embarrasses the Duke of Buckingham, who is going to hold a grudge, and Edwin gets so mad at Jane that he doesn't talk to her for a week because he thought about her dancing with another man. She doesn't even do it. She doesn't dance with anyone. And this is right after Edwin dances with several other women. He is exhausting. Afterwards, as some time passes, King Henry starts to get a little suspicious of Mary and Brandon. They've been getting even closer and keep finding excuses to spend time together, and then the wife of Louis XII, King of France, dies, and word on the street is that he, a 51-year-old man, wants to marry Mary, who is 18. Talk about a considerable age gap. Quote, "It was this, probably, which opened Brandon's eyes to the fact that he had been playing with the very worst sort of fire, and first made him see that in spite of himself and almost without his knowledge, the girl had grown wonderfully sweet and dear to him," end quote. So he starts to avoid Mary before things can get really out of hand, because there is no way that they could ever actually be together, and worst case scenario, her brother might behead him if this relationship gets too noticeable. Mary gets upset when she realizes that Brandon is avoiding her, and she confronts him, but he doesn't want to explain. Quote, "So Mary was angry this time, angry in earnest, and Jane felt the irritable palm more than once," end quote, over the next 2 weeks or so. Brandon starts making plans to flee to New Spain, which is over in the Americas, as soon as physically possible before something happens that he'll regret. Mary hears about this and has a sobbing fit at the thought of him leaving, realizing that she loves him. And then one day, she finds Brandon alone, tucked away reading in a very cozy-sounding window seat in a little library room, and Mary sits down beside him and asserts, quote, "I am going to be reconciled with you despite the way you treated me when last we met. I am going to be friends with you whether you will or not. Now what do you say to that, sir?" End quote. Brandon doesn't know what to say, and legitimately considers hurling himself through the window to escape her. And then we get another description about how hot Mary is, this time including her bosom, quote, "white and billowy as drifted snow," end quote. And Edwin, our narrator, isn't even here this time to be admiring her bosom, so did Brandon tell him that detail, or is he just fantasizing? Mary asks Brandon if she's not being kind, more than he deserves, by not making him apologize for that one time he annoyed her during the "why are you avoiding me" confrontation. And he says yes, she's being very kind. Quote, but be bad again. "No, I won't. I will not be bad, even to please you." "I am afraid you had better be bad. I give you fair warning," said Brandon huskily, end quote. Guys, this is getting really weird really fast. And then, at this point, I'm going to give a quick forewarning. There's just a couple scenes of seduction in this book with very creepy, assaulty undertones and overtones. And if those are going to make you uncomfy, I would skip a few seconds here. Mary and Brandon calm down for all of 2 seconds before she touches his arm, and he has the irresistible urge to kiss her hand, and she scolds him, but then takes his hand again, and, quote, "The hand would not satisfy now, it must be all, and he caught her to his arms with a violence that frightened her. Please don't, please not this time, ah, have mercy, Charles, well, there, Mary Mother, forgive me." Then her woman spirit fell before the whirlwind of his passion, and she was on his breast with her white arms around his neck, paying the same tribute to the little blind god that he would have exacted from the lowliest maiden in the land. End quote. He is exacting tribute for the little blind god. I will admit I thought of at least one deeply uncomfortable interpretation of that phrase. Turns out Cupid is the little blind god. I found that phrase being used in a few places to reference him, and he is sometimes depicted as blind or blindfolded. Love is blind. Anyways, Mary and Brandon are making out, until he falls dramatically to his knees, crying, "Heaven help me." Then Mary tells him she loves him, and he nearly runs away, and they have another scandalous embrace. She presses him into saying he loves her, he falls to his knees again, and then actually runs away this time. Later, when Brandon recounts this incident to Edwin, he says, quote, "If I see her again, I shall have to kill someone, even if it is only myself." End quote. Look, I get that she's pretty, but she is not worth this. After this failure of self-control, Brandon is even more determined to avoid her, which makes her upset and worried that maybe he lied about loving her, and that, combined with the threat of marriage to an old French dude slowly closing in on her, drives Mary to seek out a renowned fortune-teller, hoping he'll give her some comforting insight about her future. But going to this fortune-teller could wreck her reputation and royally piss off her brother the king, because not only have, quote, "the priests and bishops all condemned him as an imp of Satan and a follower of witchcraft," end quote, but, quote, "his house was really a place of illicit meeting, and the soothsaying was often but an excuse for going there," end quote. And no matter how pure her actual intentions may be, if people find out, they will assume the worst of her. So she concocts a scheme to go in secret with only Jane for company, which will involve the two of them walking around some shady streets around dusk unprotected. Jane doesn't want to get stabbed in a back alley, so despite being sworn to secrecy, she asks Edwin to subtly follow them for protection, just in case something happens. But Edwin has a party to go to that night, so he gets Brandon to do it, despite he and Mary not being on speaking terms right now. To be reluctantly fair to Edwin, it's not that he wants to party, it's that Henry will be pissed if he isn't there. He's the master of dance and all that. So the night of this adventure arrives, and Brandon notices that he is not the only one tailing the girls. He spies the Duke of Buckingham, who is infatuated with Mary, and who Brandon publicly humiliated before at that party, also following them. Then, once the girls enter their den of debauchery, the Duke leaves, and he didn't see Brandon. Inside, with Mary, the fortune-teller, quote, "had told her nothing she wanted to know, though much that he supposed she would like to learn," end quote, telling her that she has a low-born lover, but that he isn't true, and that she will soon marry a great nobleman or prince, which he thinks would flatter her, but is in fact both of her worst fears combined, that Brandon lied, and Louis XII is her destiny. So she and Jane head back, and Mary notices they're being followed. So Jane has to confess that she had spilled the beans, and it's just Brandon, and so Mary slaps her. Again. Then 5 minutes later, 4 masked horsemen come charging after the girls, who scream and flee. Brandon kills 2, wounds another, and this distracts the 4th and final, giving Brandon and the girls an opportunity to run. Well, Brandon and Jane run. Mary has to be carried because she was just so frightened, and it's only when she realizes that Brandon is wounded and bleeding that she is willing to use her own feet. Early the next morning, Edwin's party finally ends, and he, quote, "hastened to our rooms where I found Brandon lying in his clothes, everything saturated with blood from a dozen sword cuts," end quote. Was Brandon just planning to lie there and bleed indefinitely? Edwin goes and gets someone to fix him up, but Brandon is arrested the next night for the murder of those 2 men in the streets. Apparently, quote, "the authorities had received information from a high source that Brandon was the guilty person," end quote. Now, during the attack, one of the men's masks had slipped down, and Brandon had recognized him as the Duke of Buckingham. He's one of the 2 who survived. So this must be that high source. He is the only one who could have known Brandon was there. But for now, Brandon is keeping the Duke's involvement to himself. He doesn't even tell Edwin yet. Edwin wants to go to the king and explain that Brandon was only defending the princess, but Brandon swears him to secrecy, refusing to risk Mary's reputation. Quote, "There is only one person in the world who may tell of that night's happenings, and if she does not, they shall remain untold. She will make it all right at once, I know. She is all gold." End quote. So, quote, Brandon was taken to Newgate, the most loathsome prison in London at that time. Here he was thrown into an underground dungeon foul with water and alive with every noisome thing that creeps. There was no bed, no stool, not even a wisp of straw, simply the reeking stone walls covered with fungus and the windowless arch overhead. End quote. Sounds like a recipe for infection. Edwin stands outside in the rain all night, quote, "that I might be as near as possible to my friend and suffer a little with him," end quote, then goes to the girls, and insists that Mary tell Henry the truth at once, and she reluctantly agrees. She's been hoping that she could talk her brother out of making her marry King Louis, but to do that she'd need to be on his good side, and if Henry finds out that she went to that fortune-teller, he'll be really mad, and she will effectively be doomed. Edwin goes with Mary to make sure she sees the king, but Henry wants to talk to Edwin alone first to tell him that he has less than an hour to pack up and leave on a secret embassy mission to France. And when Edwin leaves the room, Mary has disappeared. He doesn't have time to find her, so he leaves a passive-aggressive note and has to hope that she'll get Brandon out of prison while he's gone. A month later, Edwin comes back from France and, quote, "When I returned to London, I found Brandon still in the terrible dungeon, and worse still, he had been tried for murder, and had been condemned to be hanged, drawn, and quartered on the second Friday following. Hanged, drawn, quartered!" End quote. At which point we flash back in time when Buckingham has Brandon arrested. While Edwin is alone talking to Henry, Buckingham bumps into Mary, waiting outside. Now, Buckingham has a lot of sway with the local authorities, and so Mary spies an opening, thinking maybe she can avoid telling Henry entirely and have Buckingham negotiate Brandon's freedom, taking advantage of his mega-crush on her. Buckingham agrees, but says he doesn't think he can just get Brandon released due to public pressure, but maybe he could arrange for an escape, and after a while, when things calm down, Henry could have him pardoned. Which he probably would. Brandon is Henry's favorite person to play cards with, so he'd miss him. So Mary doesn't talk to Henry, hoping that Brandon can be freed without her needing to disclose about her fortune-teller visit. And later the Duke tells her that this escape succeeded, and Brandon has fled for New Spain. So Edwin comes back from France, finds his best boy still in prison, and goes straight to the king, crying on his knees to tell Henry everything. How Mary had been involved, and how Brandon had only been protecting her, and how, quote, "the Lady Mary had promised she would tell you all, but she is a woman and was born to betray," end quote. Henry calls his sister a hussy, and has Brandon released at once. Edwin gets Brandon nursed back to health, among other things bringing in a foreign scholar/medicine man, and one of the things this man recommends is, quote, "nutritious food, although this advice was contrary to the general belief, which is that the evil spirit of disease should be starved and driven out," end quote. I am surprised any of you people are alive. He goes to see Mary to ask what the hell happened, and she explains that as far as she knew, Brandon wasn't in prison anymore. Edwin tricks her for a second into believing that Brandon had been executed, just because he's annoyed, and then tells her that he is alive and out, but wants nothing to do with her anymore. She doesn't care, and goes to apologize in he and Edwin's private rooms, which is risky and scandalous. Quote, "Gods, those were exciting moments. My heart beat like a woman's," end quote. Shut up, Edwin. Mary explains herself to Brandon, but then it turns into her blaming him for not trusting her, and her saying that his wounds caused her more anguish than they did him, and somehow this works, because she says that the reason she was so hesitant to risk making Henry angry was that she, quote, "could not bear the torturing thought of losing you or enduring any other man," end quote, if she can't talk her way out of marrying King Louis, and that's good enough for Brandon, so they embrace, and he says, quote, "I will never doubt you again. It is my turn to ask forgiveness now," end quote. She nearly got you executed, my guy. Mary and Brandon make a vow that they will be husband and wife, despite the fact that Henry is demanding that Brandon go to New Spain to get him away from Mary, and that Mary is kind of engaged. So engaged, in fact, that a date has been set for her marriage to Louis. Technically, Henry still needs her consent for the marriage, apparently, but that's treated as a pretty foregone conclusion because history and woman. Mary herself would disagree, though, and every time someone comes asking for her to consent, she tells them to go to hell. And in her anger, Edwin thinks, quote, she must have looked superb. She was one of the few persons whom anger and disdain seemed to illumine. They were so strong in her and yet not violent, end quote. Not violent, my ass. Every time she gets annoyed, she slaps her best friend. A week ago, she thrashed a guy in the face with a diamond necklace over this very consent problem. But in desperation, Mary concocts a plan. The ship Brandon is due to leave on for New Spain doesn't take women. Brandon says, quote, no woman could make the trip, and besides, the sailors are superstitious and will not sail with them, end quote. But if she sends a sum of money from a young nobleman traveling incognito with a request for a private room, maybe she could board wearing men's clothes. Brandon is reluctant to believe that it could work, but eventually decides, quote, if you wish to go, I will try to take you, though I die in the attempt, end quote. Edwin makes a comment that, quote, what seems to be bravery is often but a lack of perception of the real danger. Mary was brave, but it was the feminine bravery that did not see. Show her a danger, and she was womanly enough, that is, if you could make her see it, end quote. And then, like 2 pages later, quote, can it be possible that they are braver than we? My answer is yes, given the motive, and a woman is the bravest creature on earth, end quote. Make up your mind, at least. And also, could we have any other POV character? Please? Why did we get stuck with Edwin? He hardly even does anything. He's not even the main character. He's just the horrible filter that we have to hear everything through. Mary's first attempt at a disguise doesn't go so well, and Brandon tells her that she in no way resembles a man, because she's, quote, entirely too symmetrical and shapely, end quote. And she has small feet. Remember, feminine beauty is stored in the feet. And also symmetry, I guess. If only she could learn to dilate her nostrils, she might look like a brave and gentle man. They discuss how they might make the look more convincing, and then we get the statement that, quote, for the first time in her life she bewailed her beauty because it stood between her and Brandon, end quote. Now, Mary has frequently said that she is tired of people constantly commenting on her looks, but sure, I guess that's not quite bewailing that her beauty exists. However, it is primarily her beauty that has drawn King Louis to her, and she knows this and has expressed disdain for it, saying that her beauty has turned to curse her. So I don't think this is the first time, Edwin. On the topic of my disgust for Edwin, and here's another creep scene warning if you'd like to skip forward, he tries to force Jane to kiss him and say that she loves him, and she refuses, but, quote, I got something more before she left, even if it was against her will, something that made it almost impossible for me to hold my feet to the ground. Jane pouted, gave me a sharp little slap, and then ran away, but at the door she turned and threw back a rare smile that was priceless to me, for it told me she was not angry. Jane was one of those girls who must be captured viat armis, end quote, or by force, perhaps violently. I know it's time period, yada yada, Jane seems cool with it, but still. In the next paragraph, he says Jane's type are, quote, usually well worth the trouble, and make docile captives, end quote. I am going to vomit. Once the escape plan is all in place, Mary, Edwin, and 6 others go out hawk hunting, and Mary and Edwin separate a little bit from the group. She tells Edwin that she loves him and Jane, hopes to see them again someday, and that Jane has confessed to her that she loves Edwin. Then, quote, goodbye, my friend, kiss her 1,000 times for me. And she flew her bird and galloped after it at headlong speed, end quote. When the rest of the hunting party comes looking for them, Edwin plays dumb and leads them in all the wrong directions looking for her, buying enough time for Mary to make her escape. And despite searching all night in the rain, no one can find her. While everyone is busy the next day panicking, Edwin has Jane take a walk with him. Older narrator Edwin reminisces about the beautiful scene, perfect in his memory, quote, I see it all as I saw the light of noon that moment, and all was Jane. The softly lapping river as it gently sought the sea sang in soothing cadence of naught but Jane. The south wind from its flowery home breathed zephyr-voiced her name again, and as it stirred the rustling leaves on bush and tree, they whispered back the same sweet strain, and every fair voice found its echo in my soul, Jane, Jane, Jane. End quote. You know, that might sound very sweet if Edwin didn't have a history of poetically lying to and about the women he's wooing. Here is our last creep scene warning, thank the gods. He begs that Jane let him deliver, quote, only 1,000,000th part of the message Mary had sent, and, quote, the kisses she had asked him to give. But Jane refuses, quote, and I soon grew so angry that I asked no permission, but delivered Mary's message, or a good part of it at least, whether she would or no, and then sat back and asked her what she was going to do about it. She sat there half pouting, half weeping, and said she could do nothing about it, and that she was alone now, and if I, her only friend, would treat her that way, she did not know where to look, end quote. Okay, Jane no longer seems okay with this Viet Armis method, and it's getting upsetting to read. Edwin says that Mary had told him Jane had confessed to loving him, and she admits that it's true, through tears, so he kisses her some more, quote, without a protest from Jane, end quote, then she promises to marry him, at some point once she knows that Mary is safe. That is a horrible engagement story, and I want to give Jane a warm blanket, and maybe a pamphlet to read about red flags. Mary successfully rendezvoused with Brandon the night before, and they had a truly miserable ride through the rain, wind, and mud to their ship. Unfortunately, the wind dies out by morning and remains absent all day, so they can't set sail, and Brandon is, quote, fuming with impatience on the poop of the Royal Hind, end quote. Poop as in deck, hind as in female deer, I presume, and it's the name of the ship. I just wanted to say poop of the Royal Hind. Mary hides in her private room, but on going to see her, Brandon loses hope again. She is just too pretty to pass as a man, or even a boy. Quote, she might hold out for a while with a straight face, but when the smiles should come, the telltale dimples would be worse than Jane for untimely truthfulness, end quote. Only women have dimples. Got it? I will add that to the list. Unfortunately, everyone is then forced on deck for an inspection, and Mary's, quote, wonderful effort to appear manly is, quote, both comical and pathetic, end quote. She's tripping all over her sword and her oversized boots, and immediately draws everyone's attention. One sailor decides she is definitely a woman and starts literally ripping her clothes off, so Brandon chops off his hand, and then the entire ship devolves into fighting each other until they're broken up by the officers. And so Mary is kicked off the ship. The failure, quote, crushed her, and where before had been hope and confidence was nothing now but despair, end quote. She is somehow less upset now by the prospect of having to go marry Louis, and more at the sudden realization that Brandon could marry another woman. But he swears that will never happen, and she promises likewise. He doesn't believe either of them will have a choice, but he keeps that to himself. But surely Mary will go marry Louis, and, quote, he would most certainly wed the block and axe should the king get possession of him, end quote. But he doesn't run, because that would mean leaving Mary alone, and he is just too noble. So he is arrested, and Mary is escorted back to London. Henry, quote, called her all the vile names in his ample vocabulary, end quote, and tells her that Brandon has been sentenced to die on her behalf once again. She begs to Henry that she be allowed to die in Brandon's place, and Henry agrees to spare him if she consents, quote, decently and like a good girl to marry Louis of France, end quote, which she does. So there goes that promise. Brandon is held for safekeeping in the Tower until Mary has to leave. She asks if she can see him just once, and Henry actually agrees, but he implies that she has scandalous intentions, and somehow that's enough that she decides not to go, even though everyone already thinks she slept with him when they ran off together, and I thought she loved him so much that to be apart was a fate worse than death or whatever, but okay. She does probably get to see him once before she leaves. It's weird because it's like the only time that Edwin can't tell us exactly what happened, even for scenes he wasn't actually present in. There's just a day when Brandon and Mary are suddenly both super suspiciously chipper, like really chipper, and Jane doesn't know where Mary has been, and that's really unusual. Edwin thinks they met up, but we never find out exactly what happened, and that's weird for this book, and I don't know what that whole thing was about. And I think maybe Henry had a point about what they would get up to if they were alone together. Mary does get Henry to agree, in front of witnesses, that in the event of King Louis's death, Mary can choose her own second husband. Though Henry has absolutely no intention of actually keeping that promise, because he is the worst. Second worst, Edwin's the worst. So off Mary sails for France, along with Edwin and Jane, where she is married and crowned queen. Once there, Jane finally agrees to marry Edwin, which makes him so excited that he goes up to a statue of the god Bacchus, puts his hat on it, does a little jig, and then knocks the statue over. Okay, they are married the next morning. Now, Mary has absolutely no intention of being an actual wife to her well-detested husband, and from the start she is, quote, holding him off and evading him in a manner so cool, audacious, and adroit that it stamped her queen of all the arts feminine and demonic. She eluded him so completely that for days he would not have a glimpse of her. At times she would break violently into tears, accuse him of cruelly mistreating her, and threaten to go home to dear old England and tell her brother King Henry all about it, end quote. She is also a genuine threat to his already delicate health, encouraging him to get drunk, dance himself to exhaustion, and go out for long rides on cold days. The current heir to the French throne, the king's cousin Francis, who is also married to one of the king's daughters, falls head over heels into infatuation with Mary. She's cordial with him, which Edwin finds concerning on Brandon's behalf. Quote, I believed, in case Mary should voluntarily prove false and remain in France, that Brandon would quietly but surely contrive some means to take her life, and I hoped he would, end quote. He would what? Now, that is brought up so casually. You think Brandon would have her assassinated? Edwin and Jane go back to England, bringing a letter for Brandon from Mary, which says, among other things, that when Louis dies, Brandon should come immediately to France, because she is frightened what will happen to her, with the heir Francis so, quote, desperate for me, and I know not to what length he might go, end quote. And 2 weeks later, Brandon gets another letter, saying that Louis is on his way out already, and by the time Edwin and Brandon get to France, he is dead, and Francis is king. Quote, as soon as the restraint of the old king's presence was removed, the young king opened his attack upon Mary in dreadful earnest. He begged, pleaded, and swore his love, and within 3 days after the old king's death offered to divorce Claude and make Mary his queen, end quote. She denies him, and so he has her confined to her apartments. If he can't have her for himself, he is hoping he can marry her to a cousin of his, just to keep her at court, which is a plan that Henry is very on board with. Thankfully, Mary has made good friends with now Queen Claude, who Francis offered to divorce for her. I'm glad they get along anyways, probably bonding over mutual hatred. Claude makes an excuse to take Mary out, quote, for the ostensible purpose of hearing Mass, end quote, and when they get to the chapel, the boys are waiting for them. And as Edwin watches the couple, overjoyed to reunite, he thinks, quote, if these two had not married soon, they would have been the death of me, end quote. They've decided that the best plan is to play dumb and take Henry at his word. He had promised Mary could marry whoever she wanted when Louis died, so he can't say she didn't have permission, because surely he meant to keep his promise. So Mary lets down her hair, and she and Brandon are wed, and the hair is notable, because only maidens get to be married with their hair down. Maiden meaning unwed young woman, or virgin, so this is her saying that despite being married, she managed to stay true to Brandon. Then they make their escape on a ship arranged by Queen Claude and sail back to England. They leave Brandon on an island for safekeeping from Henry in case his reaction is murderous, and Mary and Edwin go to London to explain. Mary spins a grand dramatic tale for Henry, emphasizing her poor treatment in France, her imprisonment devolving into tears, and it's a very convincing show until she gives Edwin a sly smile that only he can see, and he bursts out laughing and then has to pretend that he is sobbing to cover it up. Henry gets all indignant, quote, the dog to treat my sister so. By every god that ever breathed, I will chastise this scurvy cur until he howls again. I swear it by my crown if it cost me my kingdom, end quote. Then Mary slips in that, quote, in order to escape and protect herself from Francis, she had been compelled to marry Brandon and flee with us. God's death, if I had but one other sister like you, I swear before heaven I'd have myself hanged. Married to Brandon? Fool! Idiot! Married to Brandon without my consent, end quote. Mary reminds him that he did give consent 4 months ago, and surely he'd known who she meant to marry. She also mentions offhand that she had married with her hair down, and this makes Henry laugh, because, quote, poor old Louis, end quote. And somehow that is so funny that it puts him in a good mood, and he's okay with it all now. And Mary even convinces him to give Brandon the title of Duke of Suffolk, though somehow only the title but not the estates. Quote, nevertheless, Brandon thought himself the richest man in all the earth, and surely he was one of the happiest. Such a woman as Mary is dangerous, except in a state of complete subjugation, but she was bound hand and foot in the silken meshes of her own weaving. Sweet, wilful Mary dropped out of history, a sure token that her heart was her husband's throne, her soul his empire, her every wish his subject, and her will so masterful with others, the meek and lowly servant of her strong but gentle lord and master, Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk. End quote. And what more fitting ending could this book have than a vaguely uncomfortable paragraph about subjugating a woman? There is a review of this book in the Bookman magazine from December of 1898, so let's start the discussion there. Quote, "Fine phrasing is not frequent, literary finish is lacking, but the writing is a labor not only of love, but for love. It is a downright love story. If it lacks the music and color of its happily chosen title, it is impregnated with its atmosphere. In one view, this lack is high art. That which to us is picturesque was to the contemporary commonplace, and so it should appear in a transcript of the memoir. The book is Mary Tudor, and she is the book. It might be said that rarely has any modern writer dared to draw a woman as this writer has drawn Mary Tudor. The book is fairly well printed, but it is atrociously illustrated. Morris Ross." End quote. Ross also thinks the scene where Mary tells her brother that she married Brandon with her hair down was high comedy and great art. This is a review I agree with in some places, and don't in others. I didn't notice a distinct lack of fine phrasing, but I also have no taste, and I was not all that infatuated with Mary, but that's not because I think she was poorly written, just the way she was written was incredibly exhausting. But not as exhausting as Edwin. It is really hard to care about anything happening in a story about the relationships between characters when 50% of those characters are awful and the other 50% are only almost tolerable. Now, calling the illustrations atrocious feels mean, but there is something about the faces. There is one in particular near the end captioned, "I was permitted to see Brandon," when Edwin visits him in the tower, and Edwin is standing so stiffly, like half behind a door, and he kind of looks like he's floating, and his face is just so empty and yet sad, and he's got these big old cheeks, and he's just staring off at the opposite wall, I guess, not at all looking at Brandon, who is just gazing pleasantly up at him from a bench. I stared into Edwin's dead eyes, laughing quietly to myself for far longer than was reasonable. And then at the end of the book, there's a, quote, "note by the editor. Sir Edwin Caskoden's history differs in some minor details from other authorities of the time," end quote, namely how Brandon's father died and that Master of the Dance was not a real courtly position. But, quote, "in all other essential respects, Sir Edwin is corroborated by his contemporaries," end quote. Now, I don't know what editor this note is supposed to be from or how nested within our framing device it is. It doesn't seem like this should be 19th century Edwin, even though he did edit his ancestors' memoirs, but that would be kind of weird. And you'd think maybe he'd have something to say about his ancestor, apparently making up his supposed position at court. But if it's an editor of the novel as a novel, then the editor is playing along with this fictional memoir angle. And, no matter how in character it is or who it was written by, I think it's very misleading to put an editor's note at the end of a historical fiction claiming that the account of a man who didn't actually exist was incredibly accurate, especially when it wasn't. It was as accurate as a historical fiction needs to be, and for all I know, this information was corroborated by his contemporaries at the time. But for starters, our reviewer from the Bookman claims that both a card game, Honor and Rough, and some sort of waltz that Brandon taught Mary were actually anachronistic to the time. This is believable, I think. I spent some time trying to confirm, but confirming it was getting more in-depth and involved than I think it might be worth. But then is where the real fun begins. There was a whole speech, early-ish in this novel, where Edwin said that if Brandon's love for Mary was allowed to grow to full strength due to his strong nature, it would never die. It would burn for the rest of his days, and he would never be able to move on to another. And remember when Mary was jealous and worried about Brandon marrying someone else, and he says, quote, "I will gladly swear by everything I hold sacred that no other woman than you shall ever be my wife. If I cannot have you, be sure you have spoiled every other woman for me," end quote. Charles Brandon, the real Charles Brandon, had a total of 4 wives, of which Mary Tudor was the 3rd. He had 2 children already when they married. Then Mary Tudor died, age 37, and within 3 months of his wife's death, 49-year-old Brandon married his 14-year-old ward, with whom he then had 2 children. He and Mary's age gap was also twice as wide. In reality, he was 30 when she was 18, and they got married. And trying to reconcile this version of Brandon with the one in the book is just very, very funny to me in a really grim sort of way, picturing him making these dramatic romantic speeches about belonging only to her while he's got 2 kids just quietly off screen. But clearly the Charles Brandon of the novel is not the Charles Brandon of reality, and that's okay. This is a historically inspired love story, not a textbook. But then don't slap an editor's note on the end saying that this is a perfect representation of reality. Especially a book that is so fictional. Edwin and Jane are made up entirely. Brandon's past is pretty heavily altered. He was already Duke of Suffolk when they were married. And the details of their wedding and how that whole scenario unfolded seem pretty changed. There are parts that seem accurate, like Henry may have actually promised Mary that she could pick her next husband after Louis. And maybe the editor's note isn't trying to claim that the story itself was flawlessly accurate, but more the historical set dressing that surrounded the story. But the dividing lines there are blurry, and that part might not even be accurate, and just this whole thing is unclear enough that it could easily confuse people, and I don't think the note should be here. Moving on from my amateur fact-checking, what was the Duke of Buckingham's plan when he attacked Mary on her way back from the fortune tellers? I don't feel like that was made clear, or else I missed it. He followed her, and then had 3 other men help ambush her, all wearing masks. Were they gonna kidnap her? Try to ransom her? If Brandon hadn't intervened, how was that going to end well for him? The only motivation I can think of that makes sense is that he was trying to catch her doing something bad to earn good boy points with Henry, but if that was the case, I don't think he'd need a disguise, and attacking her in the street might just piss Henry off. He is infatuated with Mary, so I guess there's a motive, but this just seems risky and stupid. Okay, I think that's everything I needed to talk and or complain about, so I hope I'll see you in the next one. And in the meantime, if you want to see what Edwin's dumb face looked like in that one illustration, this podcast has an Instagram, and a Twitter, and a TikTok now, all at YOBPod, YOBBPOD. And for today's life advice from the past, if you watch a man profess his deep and poetic love to another woman, only to immediately admit that he was lying when she is not into it, please don't marry him, Jane.